In just 2 weeks my wedding is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, but everything is falling apart. I've always considered myself someone who thinks things through. So, when Emily and I set a wedding date, I expected to feel certain. But 2 weeks before the ceremony, there was this nagging feeling in my gut, like a quiet alarm I couldn't ignore. It wasn't cold feet, at least, I didn't think so. It felt heavier, darker, like I was on the verge of making the biggest mistake of my life. The night it all started felt like any other. I was working in the backyard, trying to finish up some last-minute landscaping for the wedding reception we'd planned to have at home. The sun was setting, and the air was crisp, but my mind was clouded. Something felt off with Emily lately, little things, like how distracted she seemed or how she always had her phone in her hand. I chalked it up to wedding stress, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. When I walked into the house, I heard Emily's voice echoing from the living room. She was on a video call, and the volume was cranked up. I stayed by the doorway, wiping my hands on my jeans, and listened without meaning to. She was talking to Ethan, her sister Megan's husband. Ethan sounded concerned, asking if Megan was around. That's when Emily said something that stopped me cold. She told Ethan that Megan would be home in 30 minutes. I froze. Megan hadn't been here all evening. In fact, she'd told us earlier that she was spending the night out with friends. Why would Emily lie about that? As soon as the call ended, I watched Emily pick up her phone and type furiously. Her expression was sharp, her brows furrowed, and she barely noticed me standing there. She sent the message, sighed heavily, and finally looked up, flashing me a quick smile before heading upstairs. I stood there, replaying the scene in my head, trying to make sense of it. Later that night, the unease wouldn't let go. Emily had gone to bed early, claiming a headache, but I couldn't sleep. Something about the call with Ethan kept circling in my mind. Why would Emily cover for Megan? And why was she so quick to send a message afterward? I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the pieces not quite fitting together. That's when a thought crept in, one I didn't want to entertain but couldn't shake. What if Emily was hiding something bigger? It wasn't like me to snoop. I hated the idea of breaking her trust. But the feeling in my gut wouldn't let up. So, after hours of wrestling with my conscience, I grabbed her phone from the nightstand while she slept. My hands shook as I unlocked it, knowing her passcode from when she'd asked me to check directions a few weeks ago. I told myself I'd only look for anything related to Megan, that it wasn't about Emily, at least not yet. It didn't take long to find what I wasn't looking for. There, in her messages, was a long thread with Megan. My chest tightened as I scrolled through. The conversation started innocently enough, with Megan sharing updates about her day, but then it shifted. Megan was talking about Ryan, a colleague she'd apparently been seeing for the past 6 months. She mentioned sneaking out during work trips, meeting him in hotels, and lying to Ethan to cover her tracks. What's worse, Emily wasn't just listening, she was actively helping her sister keep the secret. She gave advice, reassured Megan, even suggested excuses for when Ethan's suspicions got too close. By the time I put the phone down, my hands were clammy, and my head was spinning. This wasn't the woman I thought I knew. Emily, my fiancée, the person I was about to marry, was complicit in a 6-month-long affair. She wasn't the one cheating, but she was enabling it, lying to protect Megan, and covering up something that could destroy lives. It felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, and I was standing on the edge of a cliff. I couldn't unsee it, couldn't undo the knowledge of who Emily really was. She'd always seemed so honest, so principled. But now I was questioning everything. If she could lie so easily for her sister, what else was she capable of? Was I blind to other red flags? And most importantly, could I still go through with marrying her, knowing this about her character? As I lay back down, trying to keep my breathing steady, I realized I wasn't just upset, I was angry. Angry at Megan for her betrayal, at Emily for her lies, and at myself for not seeing it sooner. One thing was clear, I couldn't let this slide. But what to do next? That part, I still hadn't figured out. The morning after discovering the messages, I woke up feeling like my world had shifted overnight. Emily was still asleep beside me, her face peaceful and oblivious, but all I could think about was the betrayal I had uncovered. I needed clarity, and the first person I thought to turn to was my older brother, Scott. He had always been the voice of reason in my life, the one who could cut through my confusion and tell me what I needed to hear, not what I wanted. I called him that afternoon and asked if we could meet. Over coffee, I spilled everything, the texts, the lies, the sinking feeling that I didn't truly know the woman I was about to marry. Scott listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with every detail. When I finally stopped, he leaned back in his chair and let out a heavy sigh. Scott reminded me that trust is the foundation of any marriage. If Emily could lie so easily to cover for Megan, what else might she be hiding? He didn't mince words, saying this wasn't just about Megan's infidelity, it was about Emily's willingness to protect her sister at any cost, even if it meant deceiving me. His advice was blunt but honest: cancel the wedding. He said it was better to face the truth now than to regret it later when the stakes were even higher. Scott's words echoed in my mind as I drove home. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right, but part of me wasn't ready to give up just yet. I needed more answers, and the next step was clear: I had to talk to Ethan. If anyone deserved to know the truth about Megan, it was him. We arranged to meet at a quiet bar later that evening. Ethan looked tense when he arrived, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced with unease. I wasted no time showing him the screenshots. His face fell as he read through the messages, his hands tightening around his drink. He admitted he had suspected Megan for a while but hadn't been able to prove anything. Seeing the evidence laid out in front of him seemed to confirm his worst fears. Ethan's reaction hit me hard. Here was a man blindsided by the person he trusted most, and I couldn't help but wonder if I was on the same path. He thanked me for telling him the truth and promised to confront Megan, but before he left, he asked a question that stuck with me: if Emily could lie for Megan, how sure was I that she wouldn't lie to me about something just as important? That night, I couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. Emily noticed my distance and pressed me until I finally told her what I knew. Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of anger or denial, she broke down in tears, admitting everything. She said Megan had always been manipulative, using guilt and pressure to keep Emily under her thumb. She claimed she had only lied to protect her sister because Megan had threatened to cut her out of her life if she didn't help. Her excuses didn't sit well with me. I told her it wasn't just about Megan, it was about her willingness to compromise her own integrity and drag me into the fallout. The argument escalated, with Emily pleading for me to understand and forgive her, but I couldn't see past the damage already done. By the time the fight ended, we were both exhausted and no closer to a resolution. The next morning, I made the decision to start canceling the wedding. It felt like ripping off a band-aid, painful but necessary. I called the venue, the caterers, even the florist. Each call felt like a small death, a piece of the life I had envisioned crumbling away. Emily was devastated, begging me to reconsider, but I stood firm. Trust was something I couldn't compromise on, and without it, there was no future for us. Despite my resolve, doubt still lingered. Had I overreacted? Was there a way to move past this and rebuild? Those questions haunted me as I began notifying friends and family about the cancellation. The responses were mixed, some supportive, others shocked and confused. But the hardest part was yet to come. Just when I thought the worst was behind me, Ethan called. His voice was steady but laced with determination. He told me he needed my help. He had confronted Megan, but she denied everything, even when he showed her the screenshots. Now, he wanted to dig deeper and find out more about Ryan, the man she had been seeing. He believed that exposing the full truth was the only way to get closure. As I hung up the phone, I realized I was standing at a crossroads. Helping Ethan could open a Pandora's box, revealing even more lies and betrayal. But it could also bring clarity, not just for him, but for me as well. I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain: this was far from over. Ethan and I didn't waste time. After our conversation, we dove into finding out more about Ryan, Megan's secret lover. Social media was our first lead. It didn't take long to locate him, a mid-level manager at some tech firm, with a profile that looked polished and professional. What we didn't expect was the personal information he hadn't bothered to hide. Ryan was married. His wife, Laura, appeared frequently in his posts, along with their young daughter, who looked about 5 or 6 years old. They looked like a happy, unsuspecting family. Seeing those pictures gave me a sinking feeling, a reminder that Megan's actions were affecting more than just Ethan. As the days went by, we worked together to piece everything together. Ethan's determination kept us moving forward, and soon, we had enough information to track Megan and Ryan's movements. It wasn't hard to figure out their routine: lunchtime meetups at secluded cafes, late-night rendezvous when Megan claimed to be working late. Each discovery only made the betrayal more real. We started taking pictures, documenting their meetings. Ethan needed the evidence if he was going to confront Megan and protect himself legally. I felt like a bystander in someone else's train wreck, but it was impossible to look away. While we were digging, Emily reached out. She sent me a series of long messages, pouring her heart out. She wrote about how Megan had always controlled her, even as children. Megan had been the golden child, and Emily had learned early on that the easiest way to keep the peace was to go along with whatever Megan wanted. Her messages were filled with regret and self-pity, but they didn't change how I felt. She had still chosen to lie, to compromise her integrity, and to involve me in a mess I didn't ask for. I couldn't bring myself to respond. The tipping point came when I officially told Emily that the wedding was off. I had already cancelled the arrangements, but saying the words to her face made it real. She broke down, sobbing and pleading, but there was no going back. She admitted that her actions had driven me away and said she didn't blame me for my decision. Still, it was heartbreaking to watch someone I once loved fall apart, even if I couldn't forgive her. Meanwhile, Ethan took the next step in his own unraveling marriage. He filed for divorce and began preparing for a custody battle over their daughter. Megan's betrayal had cut deep, but what hurt Ethan the most was discovering how far Megan had gone to cover her tracks. She had been bribing their daughter with candy and toys to keep quiet about Ryan. The thought of a child being manipulated like that was sickening, and it only strengthened Ethan's resolve to protect her. But Megan wasn't about to let Ethan walk away quietly. The day after she received the divorce papers, she showed up at my house, furious. She barged in without warning, her face flushed with anger, and demanded to know why I was meddling in her life. She accused me of ruining everything, claiming I had no right to expose her secrets. The confrontation was heated, with her voice echoing through the walls, and it wasn't long before Emily arrived, clearly distressed. Megan turned her fury on Emily, dragging her into the argument and trying to twist the narrative to make it seem like Ethan and I were conspiring out of spite. Emily, caught between her loyalty to Megan and her guilt over what had happened, was visibly torn. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her loyalty to her sister. Megan's manipulative streak was pushing her too far, and I could feel the situation spiraling out of control. As the conflict escalated, I felt like I was caught in a storm. Ethan was fighting to protect his daughter, Emily was unraveling, and Megan was lashing out in every direction. Yet, through it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Megan's revenge was only starting, and I had no idea how far she would go to try to reclaim control over the chaos she had created. I thought Megan's unannounced visit had been the peak of her outburst, but I was wrong. Only days later, she returned, her rage escalating to a dangerous level. This time, she wasn't content with just shouting accusations. She pounded on my door with enough force to rattle the frame, her voice cutting through the evening silence like a blade. When I opened it, hoping to de-escalate, she lunged at me. Her movements were wild, her nails grazing my arm as I stepped back, trying to keep space between us. The commotion drew neighbors out of their homes, their concerned faces illuminated by porch lights. Someone must have called the police because within minutes, sirens pierced the air. Officers arrived and quickly separated us, restraining Megan as she continued to hurl insults and threats. Seeing her like that, completely unhinged, was surreal. The Megan I had known, even at her worst, had always maintained a veneer of control. This was something else entirely. The police arrested Megan for attempted assault and disturbing the peace. As they escorted her away, she shouted something about how everyone would regret crossing her. Her words lingered long after the flashing lights disappeared down the street. That night, I couldn't shake the image of her wild eyes, the raw hatred in her voice. It was a stark reminder of how far she was willing to go to protect her lies. In the aftermath, Emily seemed shaken to her core. The confrontation and Megan's subsequent arrest forced her to confront the reality of her sister's behavior. For years, Emily had excused Megan's manipulations, chalking them up to sibling dynamics or personality quirks. Now, the illusion was shattered. She came to me, not to defend Megan this time, but to express her own sense of betrayal. She admitted she had been complicit for too long, enabling Megan's toxicity instead of standing up to her. Emily made a surprising decision. She offered to testify against Megan in court, willing to share everything she knew about her sister's manipulations and lies. It was a turning point for her, a step toward breaking free from the hold Megan had on her. I could see the weight lifting from Emily's shoulders as she made this choice, though it was clear the process would be far from easy. Ethan, meanwhile, was preparing for his custody hearing. Armed with the evidence we had gathered and now supported by Emily's testimony, he had a strong case. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom was tense. Megan's lawyer tried to paint her as a misunderstood victim, but the evidence spoke louder than any argument. The judge granted Ethan primary custody of their daughter, ruling that Megan could only see her under the supervision of a social worker. It was a bittersweet victory, but one that offered a glimmer of hope for Ethan and his little girl. For Emily, the fallout was even more personal. She made the difficult choice to cut ties with her family entirely. Her parents, staunch defenders of Megan, accused Emily of betrayal, but she stood firm. She began therapy to unpack years of emotional dependency and to rebuild her sense of self-worth. Watching her take these steps was bittersweet. On one hand, I admired her courage. On the other, I couldn't forget the pain her choices had caused me. Despite everything, there was a part of me that began to question whether I had been too harsh. Emily's transformation was undeniable. She was taking accountability, breaking free from the toxic patterns that had defined her life. It made me wonder if there was a path forward for us, though the wounds from her betrayal still felt raw. Then, one evening, Emily reached out to me. Her message was simple but heartfelt. She asked for a chance to prove herself, to show me that she had changed and was committed to becoming someone I could trust again. Her words stirred something in me, a mix of hope and hesitation. As much as I wanted to move on, part of me wasn't ready to close the door completely. But letting her back in would mean taking a leap of faith, one I wasn't sure I could make just yet. Several months passed before Emily and I met again. The time apart had been necessary, giving both of us space to reflect and rebuild in our own ways. When she reached out, it wasn't to ask for forgiveness or to plead her case. Instead, she wanted to talk, openly and honestly, about everything that had happened and where she stood now. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because, deep down, I knew I still cared about her. When we met, she looked different. Not physically, but there was a calmness about her, a steadiness I hadn't seen before. She began by apologizing, not just for the lies but for the ways her choices had hurt me and others. She didn't make excuses this time. Instead, she spoke about her therapy sessions, the work she had been doing to understand why she had let Megan control her for so long. Emily admitted that breaking free from her sister's influence had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but it was also the most liberating. Her words were sincere, and for the first time, I believed she was truly trying to change. Still, I wasn't sure if that was enough. I told her as much, admitting that while I still had feelings for her, trust wasn't something I could rebuild overnight. Emily nodded, saying she understood. She didn't ask for anything more than a chance to prove herself, and that's what I decided to give her. We agreed to start over, not as fiancés but as two people trying to reconnect. There were no promises, no expectations, just a mutual understanding that we would take things slow. It was strange at first, meeting her for coffee or going for walks without the weight of our past hanging over us. But as the weeks turned into months, I began to see the changes in her. She was more confident, more self-aware, and, most importantly, more honest. While Emily was rebuilding her life, Megan's world was falling apart. Her toxic behavior had finally caught up with her. The family that had once rallied around her began to distance themselves, tired of her manipulations and lies. Even her relationship with Ryan, the man she'd risked everything for, crumbled. Ryan's wife, Laura, had filed for divorce, and with his marriage over, he no longer had a reason to stay with Megan. She found herself isolated, without the support system she had always relied on. Ethan, on the other hand, was thriving. With custody of his daughter and Megan out of their lives, he was finally able to focus on building a stable, loving environment for his little girl. We stayed in touch, and every time we spoke, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in how far he'd come. His journey reminded me that even in the aftermath of betrayal, it was possible to find a way forward. As for Emily and me, we continued to take things one step at a time. Our relationship shifted into something new, something less defined but no less meaningful. We spent time together as friends, rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. She didn't push for more, and neither did I. Instead, we let our actions speak, allowing time to guide us. One evening, as summer faded into fall, I found myself sitting by the fire pit in my backyard. The space had been a labor of love, something I'd worked on in the months after calling off the wedding. It had become my sanctuary, a place to reflect and heal. Emily joined me that night, bringing marshmallows and a quiet smile. We sat there, the flames dancing between us, and talked about everything and nothing. It was a simple moment, but it felt significant. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Emily wasn't my fiancée anymore, but she had become something just as important, a friend, a companion, someone who had grown alongside me through the chaos. Whether our journey would lead us back to each other as partners was a question neither of us was in a rush to answer. For now, it was enough to sit by the fire and hope for the future, wherever it might take us.